Coppola, Director of Broker Relations and Product Development at Ex-Im Bank. Today's broker webcast will be a demonstration of the single buyer ESS short-term insurance application in Ex-Im Online. We recently revised the paper form and have, as a result, made certain adjustments to the EOL online form. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to do a demonstration of the actual application online. So I have with me here my colleagues, Charles Barnett, Senior Loan Officer, and Gene Fitzgibbon, Short-Term Credit Insurance, Vice President, Short-Term Credit Insurance, Export Credit Insurance, sorry. And so they're going to actually walk you through the demo. I think Charles will be in the driver's seat here, and Gene and I will chime in when it is we deem it necessary. We will be monitoring your questions as they come in, and as needed, we'll interrupt Charles and ask for any clarifications that you are requesting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Hopefully we can run through this without incident and explore some of the changes and, if need be, refamiliarize ourselves with how the Ex-Im Online application process works. Before I begin, I thought it might be useful. We're on just to explain where we are. I realize this is old hat to many of you, but perhaps for some of the newer brokers, it might be useful. You're looking at Ed's Testing Company, which is a fictitious company, the landing page for this company. And when you go to, if you follow my cursor, the home button, that will always bring you back to where we are right now. Also, and this is a little known secret, but somewhat useful, there is a customer service section which you can always go to and use to understand better certain parts of the Ex-Im Bank application process. You know, I'm just toggling through a few things here. It describes the policies, describes account maintenance, for example. I'm just scrolling through, and you can minimize and then open up new sections. Claims, hopefully this is not a frequent destination for you as a user of Ex-Im Online, but obviously it's here for a reason. Anyway, I just wanted to, Ed actually asked me to spend a minute reviewing the fact that this this resource exists, and it's quite helpful. Excuse me. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is go down to Act and Manage Transactions, which is how you would initiate a new application. And you go to the second hyperlink, which is Apply for Insurance Policy or Medium-Term Guarantee. Today, we're not talking about medium-term guarantees. I've clicked on the hyperlink, and it sends us to this page. We are going to select Exporter Single Buyer Insurance. I'm clicking on that and moving over here, continuing. Okay. So this is the page, I'm sure, landing page many of you are familiar with once you begin an application, before you submit an application. And I would just emphasize, well, we're going to spend a lot of time on this page, so you'll know well. But before we do, I'll just emphasize two things. The first is Ex-Im's, there's a lot, I interrupt myself. There is a lot of information on the left-hand side of the screen. The country limitation schedule sort of gets buried in there. And it's worth noting that if you click on this, it will take you to Ex-Im's CLS, looking at Mexico, for example. So here we are looking at the CLS. This is useful before you submit your application to determine if the country that you're applying for cover in, whether Ex-Im's open in the market, whether there are any restrictions, etc. I'm going to click back here. I believe that's okay. And I'm back on the landing page. So the next thing I was going to just highlight is the fact that as we go today, and this will be easier to see once we start, there are two ways to navigate on this screen. So for example, if you click continue, the middle towards the right button, it will take you to the next set of instructions and questions. Or you can also move up and click on the hyperlink itself, which is what I typically do. And you'll notice that that's just where we were. So I should have clicked on company information. Okay. This is the beginning of several, like a sort of a landing screen and several sub-screens that allow the applicant to input information about the company itself. So in this case, Ed has kindly done a little of our work for us to make this a bit more efficient today. He's chosen as a NICE code 311824. So Ed's testing company is going to be a manufacturer, maker of pasta. And then there are several categories that you can answer or decline to answer, starting with whether the company is woman-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned. Does the company have affiliates? Is there a corporate owner? In other words, a company above the company that owns shares in the company. The name of that company, how much there is in the way of sales, and then the number of employees. So I'm going to click down here. Okay. The next section allows you to enter who is the contact for the application. So this allows you to input a contact for the application. It is not, however, I repeat, not the contact for the policyholder, not the master contact person, if that makes any sense. So let's click on Bob Jones. And I beg your pardon. So Ed is reminding me we need to explain that the company does not or does have affiliates. We'll click yes. And then we will click continue. And then there's another set of questions, starting with what kind of insurance does the applicant want to buy? Comprehensive, which is commercial and political, or political only? Typically, the answer is comprehensive. Will the applicant have title to the goods at the time they are shipped? Yes or no? We'll click yes. Will the applicant be directly invoicing the buyer? We will click yes on that as well. And then the next question is this a resubmission of a prior application? You know, maybe the applicant submitted a request before, an application before, but for a variety of reasons, we were not able to service the app fully, and it was withdrawn or possibly declined. There's no penalty to do either, certainly not to withdraw the application. Obviously, if it's been declined, that's known to EXIM. In this case, if the answer were yes, then you would need to provide here the 6-digit tracking number from the prior application. I'm going to click no, and then I'm going to explain the primary reasons for applying for this policy. You can check more than one. We'll check the first for risk mitigation and continue. So it takes us to this screen. Before we fill the screen out, though, why don't we go back for a moment, if it lets us, and click on these two. All right. these two items that we formally answered yes. Will the applicant have title to the goods at time of export? No. Will the applicant be directly invoicing the buyer? No. And then let's see what happens when we click continue. So the next screen is different from the one we were just on, obviously, where we clicked yes. There's a tertiary screen. So this screen basically has, Exim Online has caught that you answered, that the applicant answered no to having title of the goods and whether the exporter would directly invoice the buyer. And so Exim Online requires that the applicant explain, provide comments. So let's do so. Obviously, we hope you would type more than that when you provide your comments, and click continue. So it's allowed us to move on. And then at the very end, if we were, we'll leave it the way it is, but at the very end, if you were to submit the application, it would send you back to that screen. So this is one of these workarounds that we're in the process of correcting, but the advice we would give you is this, and I'm not going to do it at the end because in the interest of time, we may not get to it, and also we're here now and it's probably wise to do it. Let's go back for a moment. If you were to enter no and no, or no in any case, and continue, and you get to this screen, obviously you would type in whatever the reason was for not having title to the goods at time of export and not directly invoicing the buyer. You would then continue and you would get all the way to the end and you would try to submit, but Exim Online would not allow you to do so. What it would require you to do is come back here and click yes and continue. And although we don't see it here, the screen where you made your explanation where I wrote the word test would still exist in Exim Online and would be what the underwriter would see when you submitted the application. It's, at least that's our working premise. What we recommend you do, because you may not have title to the goods or you may not be directly invoicing the buyer, is to make note of whatever you wrote in the test section in the comments section, which we'll get to. This is a bug in Exim Online that we hope to have fixed very soon, because obviously it's a little bit confusing even to us, and we'll have that corrected. So the next section is how you select your broker. If you choose to have a broker, and we encourage you as a broker community to be involved, obviously, and we encourage insureds to choose brokers. We're not going to choose a broker today, but we are going to show you how the applicant would do so. If it's an insured who has other policies with Exim, typically when we click on that select from brokers, there would be a drop-down list like the one we just saw from when you click on select new broker. So again, just in order not to show preference, we are not going to choose any of these brokers on the drop-down list, but the applicant would be able to do so at this time. For now, we'll click none so we can proceed. The next section also allows you to, or it doesn't. Yeah, I think there's a drop-down. I don't think so. Oh, I beg your pardon. It's here. It's just a little delayed. If the applicant, if the exporter is planning to assign the policy to a lender, they can at this point input who that lender would be. Seems a little less interactive than the other drop-down, but there it is. And obviously it includes a universe of banks that Exim has worked with. I'm going to close that, choose none. And then here, if the applicant has worked with a REP, a Regional Export Promotion Program, it would be the same procedure. I won't go through every last one. It's exactly like the ones above it. We'll click no and continue. At this point, we get to a screen that allows the applicant to select if there's a special coverage, and we'll go through a few of them. Some of them are simple. For example, if it's services, you can just click on that and proceed. If it's an other, we would ask that you enter some information about it in the text box. Or if it's, for example, warehouse, you can click on the next section for details and add additional information. Whether the warehouse is owned or controlled by the applicant, the insured, whether it's a bonded warehouse or neither. If it's neither, we'd like information. And then to add what city. And I'm going to say we'll say it's a bonded overseas warehouse and continue. And then let's say you are also looking to acquire pre-shipment coverage. At this point, you would input information as to why you are applying. EXIM allows pre-shipment coverage in instances where there is a tailor-made, so-called bespoke product being sold to the buyer. In other words, a product that would be very difficult for the exporter to resell in the event there is an issue with the buyer. Think factory equipment, which is part of a larger whole, and the factory equipment once made is very hard to rebuild or to repurpose for another buyer. And then, of course, here there's the request for additional information about when the contract was signed or executed or when it will be. The estimated shipping period between the contract date and the final shipment. Okay. I'm being told by my editorial board that we should move on to the next screen in the screen. Freudian slip. Screen, not screen. I'm going to go back to that other and briefly cover foreign currency. So if the transaction is not in US dollars, then we ask you to let us know what currency it will be denominated in, to enter it here and continue.
Hi, this is Jean. Just a reminder, for the short-term single buyer, currently the policy only allows for transactions in US dollars, unlike, as many of you are familiar with, the short-term exporter-held multi-buyer product that does, at the policy level, allows invoicing in hard currencies, and then upon request for basically sort of like the deductible policy of the multi-buyer, there's that standard foreign currency endorsement that many of you are familiar with. I just want to point that out because some people, I think, sometimes get confused and think the short-term single buyer policy tax is similar to the multi-buyer policy tax as far as allowing the invoicing in hard currencies, and currently it's not. So that's why Charles wanted to emphasize the foreign currency section. And I guess one other thing to emphasize before Charles goes on is just the last one is other. I mean, anything that is per se outside the quote-unquote usual sort of vanilla transaction, it doesn't hurt, or please give us as much detail as you can, either under other, if you think there's some other special endorsement we maybe need to consider, or under comments. I mean, the exporter knows their transaction, we don't, and we try to make the application short and simple to get in. So we can't cover every scenario, so we don't have hundreds of questions. And that's why we rely on you and the customer who know the transaction to provide us with as much detail or all the details as you can, if it's not just sort of a straight quote-unquote vanilla transaction.
Thank you, Jean. The other thing, maybe it's worth mentioning, insured sales by affiliates. If you're considering having additional named insureds on your policy, you need to click this. Did I click the right one? Yeah. So that when we get to the next section, the participant section, you can enter an affiliate. If you don't, then it's not possible. The XM Online won't trigger that option. So we'll continue. One thing you'll notice is that on the right-hand side, where there are the hyperlinks, there are a series of checks to indicate you've completed the information, except for one, which is the company information. There's an internal reason there's a no check there, but for the rest of them, you should see checks, and obviously that's designed to allow you to sort of keep a measure of how much you've entered in the application, how much your client has entered. So we're in the participant section. We continue to look at Ed's testing company, who's the insured. Now we need to add participants. So this is where you would, for example, add at the very minimum a buyer. And in fact, what we'll do instead of that is, let's assume that when you're applying, the name of the company that you're selling to is a company that's used XM or that's been a participant on an XM transaction before. That will allow you to choose them in this way and saves you some time. You click on the company from the drop-down if indeed it's the company that you were that you're selling to. Whoops. And then you explain who that company is, what role they play in the transaction, in this case, buyer. You continue. And you're back to this screen. So it's at this point that you could add another company. We won't do it here, but if you wanted to add an additional named insured, that would presumably be a U.S. company that's selling an affiliate to your company, selling to the buyer, and you would add that in the same way we just added this company as buyer. So we can either click continue here and get to the participant section, or you could go back there for a moment. Excuse me, participants. I beg your pardon. So it wasn't quite done. So this is the section that allows you to enter information about the affiliate and the insured. So let's say, we can say family owned and continue. And then you're now in the section that's asking for credit information about the buyer. So I'm sure for all of you who have used XM in the past, this acronym will be known to you, but primary source of repayment, or PSOR, is either the buyer itself or in some cases a guarantor company if one exists on the transaction. So it's who is XM's source of risk under the transaction, who is what it says, who is paying. So in this case, you would click we don't have another guarantor company. We have the buyer, so you click PSOR. If the company were rated, you could add the rating in this way. Anecdotally speaking, I have seen only a small handful of rated companies under ESS applications before. But obviously, if it's rated, please let us know. If you know it is, because that will help in the underwriting process for us to understand the quality of the credit. Otherwise, you would click Continue. And then credit information is the next section. And what this is talking about is, first, information about the buyer. Is it a sovereign, public, non-sovereign, or private? Again, anecdotally, more often than not, it's a private company. Is it a bank? In instances where the buyer is using a letter of credit payment structure, the risk would be a bank, not the buyer or the end user, but the bank itself. We can talk offline. I don't think there's time to delve too much into that, but that is something to know. In that case, we would say, yes, the PSOR, the primary source of repayment, is a financial institution. But in this case, we'll say no and click Continue. And this screen allows the insured, the applicant, to discuss what kind of experience it has with the buyer. This is, I wouldn't say it's the most important screen in the application, but it's in the top most important screens, because it's our way of understanding what you, the applicant, already knows, which is, have you sold to them, yes or no, and for how long? So let's say the answer were yes, and you've been selling to them since 2001, and since 2000, I beg your pardon, Ed is reminding me that we need to. So this is a company that you've sold to for 19 years, and for the last 9 on credit terms, let's say. And then what we would ask for here is that you would provide, say, I'm not going to enter all the information, and I quickly reminded that we need to enter month and year. It's a little unwieldy, but it's not so complicated. To enter your ledger or your sale, what we call ledger, but sales experience. So from when to when. So this one, for example, could be, sort of box myself in here, but anyway, and I'm just giving you an example. So let's say we'll just fill out one of them for the sake of argument. You sold $500,000 to the company, and perhaps you sold only $350,000 on credit terms. The rest was on cash. And at any one time, you had $150,000 out in terms of credit, the highest outstanding, and you sold to them on one of these. This is open account drafts is what we usually see. If it were a bank payment mechanism, it would be this unconfirmed irrevocable LC, but typically it would be open account drafts, and you would then specify what kind of terms you were offering the open account for. So up to 30, up to 60, and so forth. We'll say it was up to 60, and nothing owed at present, or we'll make it a little more complicated. So there's 10,000, but 0 here. And then if answer,
I would just press no to continue. Change your topic.
Oh, okay.
I like to emphasize,
Yeah,
as Charles noted, that this is a very important section for us. If it's a new application request from an exporter we haven't seen before with a new buyer of theirs we haven't seen before, and they have had prior ledger experience, we very much rely on this. And we also want, particularly if it's the new application, a detailed 12-month ledger history. We might not require that when these come up for renewal, depending on the experience and the creditworthiness of the buyer, exporter, and our experience with the exporter. But we found sometimes people fill this out and then we follow, and then they don't submit a detailed ledger experience when we ask for it, that the answers we get later on the detailed 12-month ledger history doesn't mirror to what they put in here. And that's one reason why we ask. Maybe they're confused about how some of these questions, what they're expected to fill out, but we always pretty much want, if you can ask your customer to provide us with a detailed 12-month ledger history when they are using ledger history as one of their credit standards. And by detailed, we mean, and we had a webinar a while ago, and we actually sent out an Excel, we had a sample Excel spreadsheet with the headings, but we like to see, obviously, the invoice number, the invoice date, the payment terms, when it's due, and then the actual payment date. So we can gauge, is the buyer paying promptly, or are they paying slow? Is it reasonably slow, or is it very slow? So again, this is a very important section, like Charles noted, but we also want an attachment with details for the past 12 months.
Thank you, Jean. So we're going to continue now. And continue from here. And then this section allows you to, because there's no product yet, describe what it is that's being sold under the cover, under the policy. So in the event that you're very familiar with the NICS codes, the nomenclature, and presumably you know exactly what you're selling, you can type it in there and then add the NICS here. I can't remember what the NICS is for pasta making. So probably the best way to find out would be to use these drop-down menus. And unfortunately, it's not a confectionery, but we'll because it looks like flour milling is pretty close. We'll add product here. There you have it. Now, if for whatever reason you're selling something besides noodles, maybe you're selling, you are in fact also chocolate confectionery manufacturer, confectionery company, you could add that here, add another product or service, but in most cases it's just one product. So then, there's some additional questions about the nature of the product. So as you, I'm sure all know, we have for the short-term policy the requirement that 51% of the US dollar value of the product being insured by EXIM was made in the United States. So we'll indicate that the pasta is made here, that it's being shipped from America as well. And luckily, it's not on the munitions control list. It's not being sold to an armed force. And before we move on, the reason that these two questions are here is EXIM has a military policy which precludes us, except in very unusual, or excuse me, very rare instances where there's something that we call dual use, any military, we preclude any military sales of military objects or to military end users. The next question is about nuclear energy. Is the PASTA being used to support nuclear energy? The answer, luckily, is no. And then, are the products new? Yes. Are the products used? No. They're not capital goods. In other words, they're not machines, for example, that could fit into a factory machinery complex. They're not tractors and so forth. And then, will any value be added post-export and before delivery to the buyer? We see this very, very seldom. We're going to say no here. And then here, this section is automatically filled out no, but if, for example, the insured, the applicant has tried to shop around with private insurers like a Euler Hermes or an Atradius or a Coface, this is the time to tell us. And that is not a problem. If it develops that private insurers have passed on the transaction for a variety of reasons, it's too small, the country risk is deemed too great, or whatever the reason may be, that's actually very useful for EXIM to know, because particularly in a case where it's a challenging credit, it's a difficult credit, the fact that the company has not been able to find insurance with a private insurer may allow us to use that as a mitigating factor to approve. The next section talks about whether or not the PASTA meets our environmentally beneficial determination. I'm clicking on the hyperlink. And you can see, we won't go through it in detail, but this is where you would read about that. Or if it's a renewable energy. Now, obviously the PASTA doesn't fit any of these categories, but in the event that you were selling solar panels or silica used in solar panels or something of the like, this is where you would tell EXIM. And then the next section is to do with SBA-defined small businesses only. And then it talks about several categories. Yeah, that'd be great if you wouldn't mind.
This is for, as Charles had mentioned earlier, we have content rules, and several years ago, we did tweak them a little bit for SBA small businesses only, where we can cover more on an invoice. We use what we call the aggregation method, and I won't go into all the details here, but if the company's a large company, obviously the answer is it's not a small business, it's the last one, and that's very easy to fill out. If it's an SBA small business, start at number A and work your way down. We have a little bit more flexibility to cover a little bit more that might not meet all the content requirements if it's an SBA-defined business. And I guess my suggestion here is, unfortunately, the rules are a little complicated, and we're, government agency, and we have requirements. So maybe before you submit it, you can send us an email, and sometimes we just have to run these by our engineers or our policy and planning division to figure out how much we can support, to give you an idea if we can support maybe 100% of it or only a certain percentage. So we're always willing, if you just want to send us an email, if it's not a straightforward content issue, send us an email ahead of time. We can check with our engineers to see if it's something we can cover. So in the interest of time here, we're just going to go with happy day scenario. It's yes, and we're not going to aggregate or anything, so we're just going to do easy one to get moving.
Was that supposed to be no on the last one? Yeah. Okay. I admit to being a little unfamiliar with that last section, so thank you very much, Jean. The next section should be relatively straightforward. It'll seem familiar from what we were doing when we talked about how your ledger experience worked. Here is the way that, in this section, the applicant is saying how they want to sell to the buyer under this policy. So let's assume we're sticking to the open account terms for the same terms that it's selling to the client now. But conceivably, yeah, they may want to ask for slightly longer terms, and that may be why they're applying for insurance. They've sold to the buyer since 2011, if you remember. We entered on 30 or 60-day terms, and they want to go out to 90 days to meet competition. They don't feel comfortable doing it without EXIM insurance or an insurance policy. The expected date of shipment, let's say, is the last day of this month. And then this is the highest amount, not within the policy period in whole, that the buyer is buying from, that the exporter is selling to the buyer, but the highest amount at any one time. And let's say that the expectation is to sell 500,000 over the year, but it doesn't, the buyer doesn't think, sorry, the exporter doesn't think it's going to sell more than 100,000 at any one time. So it adds 100. Actually, considering they already have the ledger experience that we just entered, we'll make it a little higher. Let's say 300,000 at any one time. And then in this section, it's very unusual that we see security under these applications. Typically, the answer is none.
On this section, I just want to note one thing, because I know there's some maybe brokers on the line who aren't as familiar with or newer to EXIM Bank. Unlike the multi-buyer policy, which is generally a whole turnover policy where we're getting all the basket of eligible insurance receivables from an exporter, the short-term single buyer is select risk. It's one buyer, and you can just give us certain receivables during the year that you're selling to that customer. Maybe for some reason the exporter needs it for financing only in the month of May and June, and so they want to insure those receivables, but during the year they have other open account transactions to that buyer they don't want to insure, and that's fine under the short-term single buyer. You don't have to give us all those invoices to that customer. The other thing is the short-term single buyer is used sometimes for top-up cover. An exporter might have a private sector policy with that buyer, and maybe the private sector is only willing to say do $500,000, but you need $600,000 in coverage, or your exporter does, and so you get a short-term, your exporter gets a short-term single buyer for that extra amount that the private sector is not covering. Again, it'd be helpful to explain all that or give us as much detail, again, like I said before, when you submit the application, but I just want to point that out on the short-term single buyer. It is not whole turnover, and therefore, like, the highest outstanding would be what they're anticipating based on their needs, whether it be them wanting to self-select and insure certain invoices and only give us some, or they have a private sector policy.
So I would just add, there are some instances where the exporter wants to insure just a certain part of what it's selling to this company, so select risk, as Gene said. And then there are other instances where it's decided because there's market turmoil or for any number of reasons, it wants to insure everything. So both are possible, obviously. We're going to continue to the next section. So this is a blank canvas for the applicant, and it's where we would, so sometimes we get a sentence or two, but in my favorite applications, we get at least a paragraph that just gives you the what, why, when, where, and how. What is being sold, to whom. Even if you've already entered all the information, it never hurts to say, you know, we originated this business back in 2001. We have made many site visits to the customer. We initiated credit sales to the customer in 2011. During that time, we've had sales of up to $750,000 per annum, with usually about a high credit of about $350,000 at any one time, or $350,000 on credit terms with a high credit of $150,000. The buyer has always paid on time, or the buyer has always paid, but we've noticed that even though the terms are 60 days, we normally get paid at 70 to 75. This is due to XYZ explanation that you provide. And any other information that you think might be relevant. You know, for example, we've asked for an additional named insured on the application. So we've entered the affiliate, or we've asked for overseas warehouse coverage under the policy. This is a place where even if you've entered it elsewhere in the special coverages section, for example, reminding the underwriter and giving the underwriter the real benefit of the applicant's knowledge about the deal. What's being sold, to whom it's being sold, the history. This is incredibly valuable. It's a blank canvas. We hope, though, it's fully painted by the time they've submitted the application, to give the ex-im underwriter as much context as possible. So I'm just going to type that for the time being and click. So we're going to go to this screen. This is the short-term credit standards manual, and will allow you to, as the applicant, to figure out what information is required by ex-im. So, for example, if it's a ESS transaction in the amount of $75,000, that's the credit limit being requested, that would fit into the middle category, so the 50,001 to 100,000 category. And so it's pretty self-explanatory, credit report and either a trade reference or ledger experience. So fairly reasonable, in my opinion, information documentary requirements. Don't click on that one, okay. So let's say, so you've seen that, so you know what the required documents are, you've made note, you continue, and then at this point you would browse your personal computer, your work computer, excuse me, and attach any files. So you would go into, cover slide for the, and then you would attach it in that way. And then that would be the one file that you'd attached so far. Continue. The next section gives you a chance to review. I beg your pardon. I'm going to go back a little more slowly to the top and we'll walk through it. And I apologize, I sort of ran down the page there. This gives you a chance to quickly look over, or slowly look over, at your discretion, your application. What you're asking for, a comprehensive cover, who you are, what your NAICS is, what your NAICS code is, the name of your company, who the buyer is, if there are other participants, the borrower, the guarantor, the end user, etc. This is where you would enter it. We didn't enter a broker, as you remember, but the broker, if the company had been added, the brokerage, it would be on the screen up above. And then the goods being shipped, information about the coverage being requested and the type of goods, the financed amount, credit experience, etc. So this is, and you can also review, I'm going to go down to the bottom here and just the attached, you will see, oh, wait a second, I forgot to add a credit report and my last 12 months of ledger experience. You can see what your files are, right? And also, if you had entered a great deal in the way of comments, besides just the word test, this is where you could reread it and say, oh, I really should have entered the, I forgot to enter the fact that we made a site visit 3 weeks ago, and our buyer has just installed a new packing, a new line, a new whatever you might have, to give the underwriter at ex-im a little bit more information about the transaction. Okay. So then the next, this screen is, in my opinion, well, I'll just say that it's about to get revamped to be a little bit more user-friendly and clear. The purpose of this is effectively to get the applicant to sign and print this document. Excuse me, sign and scan and submit this document. This is the application certificate, and it stands in for, in the old days when you would fill out a written application, the page where you would certify to all the information you had provided. It's very straightforward and absolutely essential for us to have this before we can issue an approval on a policy. So you would fill this, you print it out, fill it out, scan it, and then you could go back and upload it as an attachment here.
Yeah, currently the bank, we're looking to see if we can go towards electronic signatures, but unfortunately, until such time, they do need to sign, as Charles said, in ink and attach it as a PDF, so we know that they've, signed the certifications. For instance, one of the certifications is they're not federal, debarred from working with the federal government agency for whatever reason. Like I said, hopefully in the future we'll allow electronic signature so that page won't be necessary. We need that page in order to technically underwrite, and we won't issue a quote without that certification being on file. So sometimes you might get an email from our operations folks to say, hey, we noticed, we can't issue this quote, we're all ready to go because there's not a certification on file, a certification page on file. So that's just, unfortunately right now it has to be attached as a PDF, hard copy versus electronic. We're working on that though.
Thanks. So we were at the application review. As you remember, you've reviewed the information you entered. There would hopefully be a broker used here, which of course we chose none.
And just, on that point, if an application does come in and then during the underwriting they want to add a broker, we are very happy about that, and we can add you during the underwriting process, and then you can see the application once we add you, even if it hasn't been finished yet, so then you'll have access rights to it. There might be, I can't remember if there might be, say Charles added you today, the application came in and had no broker on it, and then the exporter asked Charles to add you as a broker, and he does it today. There might be a time delay, so you might not be able to see it till tomorrow. I can't remember the timing sometimes on that, but we can and we want to. If something comes in without a broker, we are happy to add a broker during the review process before a quote gets issued.
And that would be done through a broker of record letter. Once the application is submitted, you can't add the broker electronically. It has to be done by submitting a separate BOR letter.
So I'm told we have just seconds to go here, so I'm going to go to the very last hyperlink, which we just looked at briefly, where you found the application certificate. So you've done that, and then you need to read this form. By clicking on it, you read through it. It signifies to EXIM that you've done so, and then you can submit your application. Hopefully this section works. This will then give you, and I encourage you to remember the number. It'll be in your file, it'll be in your EXIM Online account, but that number, the tracking number in the top left, 710-090, that's the number when you call because you have questions or you send an email to EXIM asking about your application, or if you're a broker, your client's application. That's the way that Gene or I or anyone would find that application in the system. So I'll stop there, and thank you all very much.
All right, thank you, Charles. We're just looking at the console, not seeing any more questions. So we'll end it there. Thanks again very much. And said we'll put this recording on the website for folks who didn't have a chance to join us today. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next broker webcast. Thank you and have a good day.